When you are miles away from the nearest town, you expect to hear animals in the brush. But when the animal stands up on two legs and calls your name, you realize you made a terrible mistake coming out here alone. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. You clicked on this because you wanted to hear about the deep woods, the places where no one can hear you scream. We have 3 stories tonight about isolation and the things that live in it. This first story is about a man looking for peace and quiet, but finding something much worse waiting for him in the trees. Jack needed a break from the city. The noise, the traffic, and the constant emails were wearing him down. He rented a small A-frame cabin in northern Idaho. The listing boasted about total seclusion. It was 5 miles down a dirt road that didn't even have a name on Google Maps. There was no Wi-Fi and no cell service. That was exactly what Jack wanted. He packed a cooler full of steaks and beer, threw his duffel bag in the trunk, and drove north. He arrived just as the sun was starting to dip behind the pine trees. The cabin was perfect. It was small wooden and smelled like cedar and old dust. A large deck wrapped around the front, overlooking a dense wall of forest. Jack unpacked his car and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. It felt fresh, but there was a faint underlying smell of something musky. He assumed it was just damp wood or maybe a dead raccoon nearby. The first night was peaceful. He made a fire in the wood stove, cooked a steak, and read a book. The silence was heavy. In the city, silence is never real. There is always the hum of a fridge or a distant siren. Here, the silence felt like a weight pressing against his ears. Around 2 in the morning, Jack woke up. He didn't know what woke him. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The cabin was cold. He lay still in the loft bed, listening. Then he heard it. It sounded like footsteps on the gravel driveway. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Jack sat up. He knew bears were common in the area. He had brought a can of bear spray just in case, leaving it on the kitchen counter downstairs. He crept to the small window in the loft that looked out over the driveway. The moon was full, casting a pale blue light over the clearing. He saw a shape near his car. It looked like a deer. It was large, maybe a buck, but he couldn't see any antlers. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing the cabin. Jack relaxed. It was just a deer. He watched it for a minute, waiting for it to move. It didn't graze. It didn't twitch its ears. It just stared at the cabin. Then the deer did something impossible. It reared up on its hind legs. Jack expected it to hop or reach for a high branch. Instead, it straightened its back. It stood fully upright, balancing perfectly like a man. Its front legs hung down loosely at its sides. The joints looked wrong, like they were bent in too many places. Jack stopped breathing. The thing took a step forward on 2 legs. It wasn't a hop. It was a stride. It walked toward the porch with a jerky, unnatural motion. Jack scrambled backward from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the heavy thud of weight landing on the wooden deck stairs. 1 step, 2 steps. The wood creaked under something much heavier than a man. He stayed in the loft, terrified to make a sound. He heard the creature walking around the wraparound deck. It moved slowly. Every few seconds, there was a sound like wet leather rubbing against the wood. It circled the entire cabin. Then it stopped right in front of the main door. The doorknob rattled. Jack had locked it, but the lock was just a simple turn button on the handle. It wasn't a deadbolt. The knob turned left, then right. The door shook in the frame. The thing on the other side let out a sound. It wasn't a growl. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Then a voice came through the door. It was flat and monotone, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Let me in." It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of water. Jack grabbed a heavy flashlight from his bedside table, his hand shaking so bad he almost dropped it. He didn't answer. He knew the old rules of the woods. You never invite them in. You never acknowledge them. "Jack, let me in." The creature knew his name. A cold sweat broke out on Jack's forehead. He hadn't spoken to anyone since he stopped for gas 4 hours ago. He hadn't told anyone his name. The pounding started. It wasn't a fist. It sounded like a hard, bony hoof slamming against the wood. The door bowed inward with each hit. Dust fell from the ceiling. Jack realized he was trapped. The only way out was the front door or the sliding glass door on the side, and the creature was right there. He crawled to the edge of the loft and looked down at the living room. The moonlight was streaming through the windows. He could see the shadow of the thing through the frosted glass of the front door. It was tall. The head was almost touching the top of the doorframe. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. Jack waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. He thought maybe it had given up. Maybe it was gone. Then he heard a tap on the glass. He turned his head toward the sliding glass door on the side of the cabin. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin. A dark shape was pressed against the glass. A long, dark finger with an extra joint was tapping on the pane. Tap. Tap. Jack. Outside. The voice was coming from the glass now. It sounded different this time. It sounded like his brother. It was a perfect imitation of his brother's voice, but without any emotion behind it. His brother lived in Florida. His brother was not in the woods of Idaho. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. He gripped the flashlight like a club. He told himself it wasn't real. He told himself he was having a nightmare. But the smell of musk and rot was seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. It smelled like old meat left in the sun. The tapping got harder. The glass began to vibrate. If that glass broke, there was nothing between him and that thing. Jack finally yelled out, "Go away! I have a gun." He didn't have a gun. He hoped the bluff would work. The tapping stopped immediately. For a second, Jack thought it worked. Then a sound erupted from outside that chilled his blood. It was laughter. But it wasn't human laughter. It was the sound of a coyote yipping and howling, twisted into the rhythm of a human laugh. It was mocking him. The creature didn't try to break the glass. It just stood there, breathing heavy, wet breaths that fogged up the window. Jack sat in the corner of the loft, staring at the stairs, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. He just watched the shadows shift as the moon moved across the sky. Hours passed. The breathing stopped. The shadow retreated from the window. When the sun finally crested over the mountains, filling the cabin with gray morning light, Jack was stiff and freezing. He waited until the sun was fully up before he moved. He crept downstairs, bear spray in one hand, flashlight in the other. The cabin was empty. The front door was still locked. He walked to the sliding glass door and pulled back the curtain. The glass was smeared with a greasy yellow substance. He unlocked the door and stepped out onto the deck. The air was cold and still. The birds were singing as if nothing had happened. Jack walked around to the front door. The wood was scarred. There were deep gouges in the solid oak, like something had tried to carve its way through with knives. But the worst part wasn't the door. It was the dirt around the porch. In the soft mud, there were prints. They looked like deer tracks, but they were wrong. They were too deep, and they were spaced out like a man walking. And right next to the hoof prints, there were handprints. Long, thin handprints with 6 fingers. Jack didn't even pack his bag. He grabbed his keys and his wallet. He got in his car and drove. He didn't look in the rearview mirror until he hit the paved road 5 miles away. He never went back to the cabin. He paid a moving company to go get his things a week later. They told him everything was fine, but they asked him one question. They asked if he had a dog. He said no. They told him it was strange, because the inside of the cabin smelled like a wet, dirty animal, and all the mirrors in the bathroom had been smashed. Jack was lucky he didn't open that door. Whatever was out there wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't his brother. It makes you wonder what really watches us when we think we are alone in nature. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Are you in the city or out in the woods? If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for the next 2 stories in this series. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from being 40 feet in the air in a glass box. You can see everything coming from miles, but when something finally climbs those stairs to get you, there is nowhere left to run. You are listening to the Black Hour Stories. We are continuing our journey into the deep woods. Our first story showed us that cabins aren't safe. Now we go higher. This second story is about a fire lookout in Oregon. These towers are designed to keep people safe, to spot danger from far away. But sometimes the danger isn't a fire. It's something that walks out of the smoke. Sarah took the job as a fire lookout because she wanted the view. She was stationed at Desolation Peak in a 60-foot tower overlooking a massive valley of fir trees. It was a lonely job. She spent weeks at a time without seeing another human face. Her only contact was a crackly radio connection to the base station 20 miles away. For the first month, it was routine. She woke up, scanned the horizon for smoke, radioed in her report, and read paperback novels. The isolation was peaceful. The wind howled through the metal grating of the catwalk, and the storms were magnificent. But in late October, the atmosphere changed. The woods went quiet. Usually, Sarah could hear birds, the rustle of wind in the trees, or the distant call of elk. But on a Tuesday afternoon, the silence fell like a heavy blanket. The air grew still. The sky turned a bruised purple color, even though there were no storm clouds. Sarah grabbed her binoculars and did a sweep of the tree line. That's when she saw it. About a mile away, in a clearing of tall grass, there was a figure. It was bright yellow, standing out sharply against the dark green of the forest. It looked like someone wearing a heavy rain slicker, the kind fishermen wear. But it wasn't raining. It hadn't rained in weeks. Sarah adjusted the focus. The person was standing perfectly still. They weren't hiking. They weren't setting up camp. They were just standing there, facing the tower. Sarah waved. She knew they probably couldn't see her from that distance without binoculars of their own, but it was instinct. The figure didn't move. She went back to her book, checking every 10 minutes. An hour passed, 2 hours. The yellow figure hadn't moved an inch. They hadn't sat down or shifted their weight. They stood like a statue in the middle of the wilderness. A cold feeling started in Sarah's stomach. It wasn't natural for a human to stand that still for that long. She grabbed the radio handset. "Base, this is Tower 4. I have a visual on a hiker in Sector 3. Stationary for 2 hours. Possible medical issue. Over. Static." She tried again. "Base, do you copy?" Nothing but white noise. She checked the batteries. They were full. She checked the antenna connection. It was fine. The radio was dead, cut off by something other than bad reception. The sun began to set. The valley plunged into shadow. Sarah looked through the binoculars one last time before the light failed. The yellow figure was gone. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe just a weird hiker who finally moved on. She locked the heavy trapdoor that led down the stairs, a strict rule for lookouts at night, and made tea. Darkness took over. The glass box turned into a mirror, reflecting the inside of the cabin. Sarah tried to read, but she felt exposed. She turned off her lantern so she could see out into the night. The moon was a thin sliver, offering barely any light. Then she heard the sound, clang. It was the sound of a boot hitting the bottom metal step of the tower. Sarah froze. The tower was 60 feet high. The stairs zigzagged up in open air. There was no reason for anyone to be climbing them in the pitch black. Clang, clang. The steps were slow and heavy. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They were taking their time. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and a flare gun she kept in the emergency kit. She didn't have a weapon, but a flare to the chest would stop most things. Clang. They were halfway up. Sarah went to the window and shined her flashlight down through the grate. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the stairs. There was the yellow raincoat. It was climbing, but as the light hit it, Sarah screamed. The raincoat was empty. It was inflated, as if a body was inside it, but there were no hands coming out of the sleeves. There were no boots in the pant legs. The coat and pants were moving on their own, bending and stepping as if an invisible man was wearing them, and where the head should be, there was nothing. Just the popped collar of the yellow slicker surrounding empty air. The thing stopped when the light hit it. The empty sleeves rose up, grabbing the handrail. It pulled itself up another step. Sarah scrambled back from the window. She checked the trapdoor lock 3 times. It was a solid steel bolt. She piled her heavy trunk of books on top of it, just to be sure. The footsteps reached the top landing. She could hear the heavy, wet fabric of the raincoat brushing against the door. Then a knock. It wasn't a knuckle. It sounded like wet meat slapping against the wood. Slap, slap. "Open," a voice said. It wasn't a voice from outside. It was coming from her radio. The dead radio on the desk crackled to life, speaking the word clearly. "Open." Sarah stared at the radio in horror. "Go away." She screamed at the door. "Open, cold, open." The radio voice was changing. It started deep, but then shifted pitch, becoming higher. It sounded like Sarah's own voice. "Open. I'm cold." "Sarah, open the door." It was recording her. It was using her words. The thing outside slammed against the trapdoor. The heavy wooden hatch jumped an inch, lifting the trunk of books. Sarah threw her weight onto the trunk. She could feel the power of the thing beneath her. It wasn't wind. It was a solid, massive force pushing up. The yellow raincoat was squeezing through the cracks. She saw slivers of yellow urethane pushing through the seams of the doorframe, bubbling like melting plastic. It smelled like burning rubber and ozone. Sarah fired the flare gun through the glass of the window, hoping to signal someone, anyone. The red light exploded into the night, illuminating the catwalk. For a split second, she saw that the raincoat wasn't empty anymore. Filled inside the hood, staring through the glass, was a face made of smoke. It had no eyes, just a gaping, swirling mouth. The radio screamed. It was a high-pitched screech of feedback that shattered the glass of the lantern. Sarah covered her ears and curled into a ball on top of the trunk, sobbing, praying for the sun to come up. The pounding continued for hours. The radio kept whispering her name in her own voice. When the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the pounding stopped instantly. The radio went silent. Sarah didn't move for another 2 hours. When the sun was fully up, shining bright and warm on the glass, she finally stood up. She moved the trunk and unlocked the trap door. She pushed it open, ready to swing the flashlight. The stairs were empty. But on the metal landing, right outside the door, lay the yellow raincoat. It was shredded, torn into ribbons as if a pack of wolves had torn it apart. And underneath it, melted into the metal grating, were scorch marks in the shape of bare human footprints. Sarah radioed for a helicopter extraction 10 minutes later. The radio worked perfectly. When the rescue crew arrived, they asked about the raincoat. Sarah told them she didn't know whose it was. One of the pilots picked it up with a stick. He turned pale. He showed Sarah the inside of the collar. Written in black permanent marker was a name, Daniel. Daniel was the name of the lookout who had staffed Tower 4 in the 1980s. He had vanished during a storm and was never found. Sarah never went back to fire watch. She lives in the city now, on the ground floor. She says the worst part wasn't the ghost or the creature. It was the fact that the radio worked just fine when the thing wanted to speak. It means it wasn't broken. It was just waiting for the right time to say hello. Tell us in the comments, could you spend a night alone in a fire tower, knowing you're the only light for 20 miles? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to like the video so we can find you in the dark. When you spend your life on the road, you get used to wildlife crossings. But when a creature that looks like a dog runs in front of your truck and then stands up to look you in the eye, you know you're facing something that belongs nowhere near the highway. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. This is our third and final story tonight, wrapping up our theme of isolation and the darkness that lives in remote places. We have been in a cabin and a fire tower. Now we are on the open road. This story follows a truck driver named Dave, a man who thought he had seen everything until he drove Route 50 in the dead of night. Dave had been driving trucks for 25 years. He drove all the lower 48 states and knew the roads like the lines on his own palm. He was a professional driver, rarely sped, and always checked his rig. He hated driving through the emptiness of Nevada, but that's where the route took him. He was on U.S. Route 50, a stretch they called the loneliest road in America, and he was driving at 3 a.m. There were no lights, no towns, and no cell service for dozens of miles at a time. The only sound was the deep rumble of his engine and the rush of the air past the cab. He was running on coffee and muscle memory. The moon was high and bright, making the scrub brush and the jagged mountains look bleached white and spooky. He was deep in the desert when it happened. He saw a flash of brown fur run out from the darkness on the passenger side and dart right across the highway. It was large, maybe a German shepherd or a husky, but it was moving fast. Dave instinctively slammed on the air brakes. The 18-wheeler screamed, shaking the whole cab, and the truck skidded. Dave swore, gripping the steering wheel. He was sure he had hit the dog. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the whole rig rocking to a stop. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and got out. The sudden silence was shocking after the engine roar. The desert air was intensely cold, and it carried a sharp mineral smell like rust and dry dirt. Dave walked back to where he thought he had hit the animal. He searched the pavement and the shoulder. He looked for blood or fur or any sign of a dog. There was nothing, not a scrape, not a sound. It was as if the animal had simply vanished. Dave figured he must have stopped just in time. The adrenaline made his head fuzzy. He turned to head back to the truck. That's when he saw it again. It was standing about 20 feet away, near the wire fence that separated the highway from the desert. It was the same dog. It was massive, dark brown, and looked like a starving wolf. It was perfectly still, staring at him. Dave raised his flashlight and shined the beam directly onto the animal. The light didn't bother it. The dog didn't squint or turn its head away. It just stood there, staring. Its eyes reflected the light back bright yellow, like car headlights. And then, slowly, the dog stood up. It rose onto its hind legs, straightening its spine and stretching its body until it was taller than Dave. It was easily 6.5 feet tall. The transformation was unsettling. Its legs didn't seem to bend the way a dog should. They stretched and clicked into place. Its front paws, still covered in dark fur, hung down like human hands, long and spindly. The creature didn't move any closer. It just stood there in the moonlight, its head caught slightly to the side, looking at him with intelligent, patient interest. Dave dropped the flashlight. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and sprinted back to the cab, scrambling to get inside and lock the door. He threw the truck into gear and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared, and the truck started to move, slow at first, then picking up speed. Dave was shaking so violently he could barely hold the wheel straight. He looked into the passenger side mirror. The creature was gone. Dave felt a wave of relief wash over him. It must have retreated into the dark. He sped up, pushing the massive truck far past the speed limit, needing to get to the next town, no matter how small. He drove for maybe a minute, staring straight ahead at the lonely road. Then a movement flashed in his peripheral vision. A dark shape was running alongside the passenger door. Dave didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. He turned his head slowly. The creature was keeping pace with the truck, running on its two back legs. The movement was a blur of dark fur and unnatural speed. Its long, clawed front hands were swinging wildly. The dog's face was pressed against the glass of the passenger window. It wasn't a dog face anymore. The fur around the muzzle was receding, pulled back like rubber. The snout had flattened into a horrifying, stretched parody of a human face. It had too many teeth, and they were all sharp. Its yellow eyes were wide and focused only on Dave. The creature smiled. The smile was wide and empty, reaching back to its ears. It looked like something wearing a mask of human agony. Dave yelled, a sound that was lost to the engine noise. He veered the truck wildly, trying to swerve into the creature, but the thing was too fast. It kept up with the truck easily, gliding over the desert floor. Then Dave heard a sound over the engine noise. Screech. It was the sound of metal being dragged across glass. The creature was using one of its long clawed hands to rake the passenger window. Dave pushed the truck faster, praying for the dawn. He felt something cold penetrate the cab. The smell of rust and the wet dog musk filled the air. He drove like that for 30 straight miles. The creature kept pace. Its smile never changed. It just ran beside him, scratching at the glass and staring. Finally, just as the sky began to turn a weak, watery gray in the east, the creature suddenly dropped back. It disappeared instantly into the shadows of the rising sun. Dave didn't slow down until he reached the first gas station in the next state. He pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and slumped over the steering wheel, shaking uncontrollably. He sat there for an hour, waiting for his hands to stop trembling. Finally, he got out of the cab to stretch. He walked around to the passenger side, expecting to find the window smashed. The window was intact. It was a thick tempered glass designed to withstand road debris. But running vertically down the glass, directly over where the creature's distorted face had been pressed, were 3 deep, parallel gouges. They weren't just surface scratches. They were etched deep into the glass, like someone had carved them with a diamond. No animal paw could have done that. Dave sold his rig a month later and took a job working in a warehouse. He never drove a lonely road at night again. The trucker still has the pictures of those marks on his phone. He knows it wasn't a dog, a coyote, or any animal on 4 legs. It was something that found the most isolated road it could and waited for the light to go out. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to the Black Hour Stories. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. And if these stories kept you looking over your shoulder, please smash that like button and subscribe for more nights just like this one.